July 1988, Harlan County. The heat was not a blanket. It was a weight. It pressed down on the cracked soil of Arthur Mills's farm, on the tin roof of his barn, and on the spirits of the men who gathered at the feed store in town. For 2 years, the rain had been a hesitant visitor, arriving in brief, angry bursts that hammered the topsoil into a hard pan before running off into the ditches, taking the best of the land with it. Now, in the 3rd year, it had stopped visiting altogether. Arthur Mills was 72 years old. He had been born in the clapboard house that stood 300 yards from the county road, and he had worked the same 320 acres his father, Thomas Mills, had worked before him. He was a man made of straight lines and quiet habits. His shoulders were stooped from a lifetime of labor, but his hands were steady. He moved with a deliberation that younger men mistook for slowness, but which was in fact a deep and abiding efficiency, born of decades of repeating the same essential tasks. The problem was the north-facing 80-acre field. It was his best cornfield, the one with the deep loam his father had called black gold now. It was the color of a fired brick, webbed with cracks wide enough to swallow a wrench. The corn stalks from the previous year's failed crop stood like brittle skeletons, their leaves long since crumbled to dust that swirled in the hot, relentless wind. The field was not just fallow, it was defeated. It looked like the surface of a dead planet. This particular kind of defeat was becoming a permanent feature of the landscape in Harlan County. The Henderson farm, 2 miles to the west, had sold 60 acres to a developer from the city who planned to put up weekend cabins. The Garvey brothers, to the south, had taken out a second mortgage to drill a new well, only to have it run dry in 6 months. They had sold their herd of Hereford cattle a loss in May. The talk in town was of federal aid, of disaster declarations, and low-interest loans that were just another name for a slower kind of foreclosure. The problem was accepted as a permanent condition, an act of God that was beyond the scope of ordinary men. David Klein did not consider himself an ordinary man. He was 28 years old, held a master's degree in agronomy from the State University, and was the newly appointed county extension agent. He drove a white Ford F-150 with a government seal on the door and carried a stainless steel soil probe and a digital moisture meter. He arrived at Arthur's farm on a Tuesday morning, the air already shimmering with heat. He wore a pressed khaki shirt and a look of professional sympathy. Arthur met him by the barn. He had been sharpening the discs on his old cultivator, the rhythmic scrape of the file on steel the only sound in the still air. He wiped his hands on a red cloth and nodded a greeting. He did not offer a handshake. His hands were coated in a fine film of grease and metal filings. "Mr. Mills," Klein began, his voice clear and confident. "I'm David Klein from the County Extension Office. Just making the rounds, seeing how folks are holding up in this drought." Arthur nodded again. "It's dry," he said. The statement was so complete in its simplicity that it left no room for addition. Klein smiled, a practiced, reassuring expression. "That it is. I was hoping I could take a look at your North 80. The satellite imagery we're getting shows severe soil degradation. We're trying to build a county-wide database to help manage the crisis." Arthur gestured with his head toward the field. "It's there." They walked together, the young man's long strides forcing Arthur to a slightly quicker pace than he preferred. Klein talked as they walked, his words filling the silence. He spoke of evapotranspiration rates, of subsurface water tables, of capillary action in loam versus clay. He used terms like long-term yield forecasting and soil amendment protocols. Arthur listened. He did not speak. When they reached the edge of the barren field, Klein stopped. He shook his head, a small, theatrical gesture of dismay. "This is what we're seeing everywhere," he said. "Total moisture depletion. The organic matter is practically zero. It's baked solid down to 18 inches. He unstrapped the soil probe from his belt. He tried to push it into the ground. It went in 2 inches and stopped with a dull thud. He grunted, put his shoulder into it, and managed another inch. He pulled it out. The tip was hot to the touch. "Hard pan," Klein announced, as if discovering a new continent. "The topsoil has blown off, and what's left is compacted into a layer as hard as concrete. Water can't penetrate it, and roots can't break through it. There's no subsoil moisture to draw on." He took out his digital meter, jabbed the short prongs into the surface, and frowned at the reading. 3%. Might as well be dust. He turned to Arthur, his expression now a mixture of pity and clinical detachment. Mr. Mills, I'll be frank. This field is dead for the foreseeable future. My official recommendation is to leave it fallow. Plow it under to break up the hardpan, sure, but don't waste your money on seed. There's nothing for it to grow in. We can get you on the list for federal drought relief. It's not much, but it's better than throwing good money after bad. Arthur looked out over the expanse of cracked earth. He looked at the sky, a pale, washed-out blue. He looked at the young man with his clean shirt and his confident pronouncements. I'm going to plant corn, Arthur said. Klein stared at him. He seemed to be waiting for the punchline of a joke. When none came, his professional smile flickered. With all due respect, sir, that would be unwise. The models are very clear. Without at least an inch of rain per week, which we haven't seen in 2 years, nothing will germinate. And even if it did, the roots would hit that hardpan and the plant would wither in a week. You'd be burning fuel and seed for absolutely no return. I'll plant corn, Arthur repeated. He was not arguing. He was stating a fact. And clover. This time, Klein could not suppress a small, incredulous laugh. Clover? A cover crop? Mr. Mills, a cover crop will compete with the corn for what little moisture there is. That's standard agricultural science. In a drought, you want as little competition for resources as possible. You want to give the cash crop every advantage. Arthur's gaze did not waver. I'm planting clover between the rows. Klein sighed, the sound of a patient teacher dealing with a stubborn child. Look, I understand. You've been farming this land your whole life. You have your ways. But we have data now, scientific analysis that tells us what works. In planting a water-hungry cover crop in the middle of the worst drought in a century, it just doesn't work. He gestured to the dead field. The evidence is right here. The evidence is incomplete, Arthur said, turning to walk back toward the barn. The conversation, for him, was over. The story of Arthur Mills's decision traveled through the county with the speed of gossip. It was discussed over coffee at the diner, over the counter at the hardware store, and most thoroughly at the Saturday morning gathering at the co-op feed store. Here, among the dusty sacks of feed and the scent of fertilizer, the collective wisdom of Harlan County's farmers was distilled. Hank, the co-op manager, leaned on a stack of salt blocks. Heard from David Klein. He was out to see old Arthur Mills. Told him that North Field was a lost cause. A farmer named George, his face a roadmap of sun and worry, shook his head. Arthur's planting it. Corn. And get this, clover. A collective groan went through the small group of men. They were not cruel men. They respected Arthur Mills. They knew he was a good farmer, a man who paid his bills and kept his fences mended. But this was different. This felt like a surrender to delusion. Clover. Another farmer, Bill, said, his voice laced with disbelief. Might as well plant dollar bills for all the good it'll do. He's pouring water into a bucket with no bottom. It's a shame, Hank said, summing up the consensus. He's a proud man. Too proud to take the government money, I suppose. But pride doesn't make it rain. He's going to lose that field, lose his savings, for nothing. The men nodded in sober agreement. They saw Arthur's plan not as a strategy, but as a symptom of age, of a man losing his grip on the hard realities of modern farming. They saw him as a relic, stubbornly tending to a past that no longer existed. Their pity was genuine. It isolated Arthur more than any open mockery could have. That evening, Arthur sat in his worn armchair in the living room. The sun had set, but the house retained the day's heat. He did not turn on a light. He could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the chirping of crickets outside, a sound that seemed to mock the dry, silent fields. The weight of the community's doubt was a palpable thing, a pressure in the quiet room. He had felt it in the way Hank looked at him at the co-op, in the way his neighbor, Bill, had given him a too-quick wave before turning away. They thought he was a fool. He was not a fool. He was a man with a memory. He closed his eyes, and the memory came to him, as clear and solid as the oak table in his kitchen. It was the summer of 1954. He was 18 years old, strong, and full of the easy certainties of youth. There had been a dry spell that year, not a true drought like this one, but 6 weeks in June and July without a meaningful rain. The corn in the North 80 had begun to curl, the leaves turning a sickly, pale green. He remembered standing at the edge of that same field with his father, Thomas Mills. His father was a man of fewer words than even Arthur, a man who communicated through gesture, through the set of his jaw, through the way he would pick up a handful of soil and let it run through his fingers. "It's burning up, Pa," Arthur had said, the frustration raw in his voice. "We need rain." His father had not looked at the sky. He had looked at the ground. He had knelt, not with the creak of old bones that Arthur now felt, but with a fluid, practiced motion. He pointed to the space between the corn rows. It was a carpet of lush, green clover, dotted with small red blossoms. The bees were busy among them, a low, contented hum in the hot air. "The corn is fine," Thomas had said. His voice was low and gravelly, the sound of stones rolling in a slow creak. "Fine, look at the leaves curling. It's starving for water," Arthur had insisted. His father had shaken his head. He dug his fingers into the soil beneath the clover, pulling back the thick mat of leaves. The earth beneath was dark and cool to the touch, almost moist. He held it out for Arthur to see. Then he moved a foot away into the bare dirt of the tractor track and dug his fingers in again. The soil there was pale gray, dry as ash, and warm from the sun. "The soil," his father said, letting the dry dirt sift away, "is a sponge, not a bucket. You understand the difference." Arthur had shaken his head. "You fill a bucket from the top," Thomas explained, his gaze fixed on the field. "You pour water in, and it holds it until it's used up. That's what everyone thinks farming is. Pray for rain to fill the bucket." He gestured to the clover. "A sponge is different. It can soak up water from any direction, but its real trick isn't soaking water up. It's not drying out in the first place. You don't fill a sponge from the top. You keep it from drying out. This clover, it's a living shield. It shades the soil from the sun. The ground here is 10, maybe 15 degrees cooler than the bare ground. That's water that doesn't evaporate. It's a blanket in the winter and a shade in the summer." He had pointed to one of the clover plants. "And look here." He pulled it up gently, teasing the roots from the soil. A long, thick taproot, like a pale carrot, came with it, trailing a web of finer filaments. It was over a foot long. "This is a deep root red, not the common stuff. Took me years to get a good stand of it. This taproot, it goes down. It goes down past the plow line, down into the subsoil. It breaks up the hard pan while it's still soft. It creates channels. When a rain does come, the water doesn't just sit on the top and run off. It follows these channels deep into the ground. And when it's dry, this root pulls up moisture from depths the corn can't reach yet. It brings it up into the plant, and at night, some of that moisture is released back into the topsoil. It's a pump and a shield and a well, all in 1 inch." He had stood up and looked his son in the eye. "People will tell you it's a weed, that it steals water from the corn. What they don't understand is that the corn and the clover are working together. The clover keeps the ground cool and soft and brings up the deep water. The corn provides a little shade for it later in the season. And all the while, the clover is pulling nitrogen from the air and putting it into the soil for free. It feeds the corn. They are partners. Remember that. This isn't a factory. It's a community. Under the ground, it's a community. That was the principle, the core of it. The water doesn't disappear. It just goes deep. The soil is not a container, is a medium. The plants are not competitors. They are collaborators." It was a truth his father had learned from his own father, a truth that had been tested and proven on this very land, long before there were county agents with digital meters. Arthur went to the roll-top desk in the corner of the living room. From the bottom drawer, he pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. The cover was worn smooth, the corners soft with age. On the first page, in his father's elegant, looping script, was written, North 80. 1921 inch. He opened it. The book was a detailed history of the field, a lifetime of observation recorded in neat columns. Each year had a page. Date of last frost. Date of planting. Seed variety. Rainfall, measured in a tin can on a fence post, and meticulously recorded after every shower, down to the quarter-inch. And, starting in 1935, two new columns, Clover density and soil condition. Arthur turned the brittle pages. 1936, a dry year. The entry for Clover density read, thick, full cover. The yield for corn was 90 bushels an acre, a miracle at the time. He found 1954, the year of his memory. Clover density, very thick. Taproots to 14 inches, the yield that year, despite the 6-week dry spell, was 125 bushels an acre, his father's best yet. He flipped forward through the years, his own blockier handwriting replacing his father's. 1975, a wet year. Clover thin, tilled under half, the yield was high, but the note on soil condition read, some compaction. Runoff, 1981, another dry year. Reseeded clover in spring. Good cover by June. The yield was 110 bushels, while his neighbors had barely managed 70. The ledger was not a collection of memories. It was a repository of data. It was science, conducted not in a sterile lab, but in the living soil of his farm. It was a physical manifestation of knowledge, passed from one generation to the next. The county agent had his satellite images and his computer models. Arthur had this book. He trusted the book. The next morning, Arthur did not go to the field. He went to the barn. He walked past his newer, larger tractor, a 1978 International Harvester that he used for heavy plowing, and went to the far corner. Under a dusty canvas tarp was his father's tractor, a 1958 John Deere Model B. It was a small, simple machine with the distinctive putt-putt sound of its two-cylinder engine. It was underpowered by modern standards, too small for the massive implements used by his neighbors. But it was light. It wouldn't compact the soil. He pulled off the tarp. The green paint was faded, but there was no rust. His father had taught him that rust was a sign of neglect, a moral failing. Every winter, Arthur had cleaned, greased, and repainted any part that showed wear. He checked the oil, which was clean. He checked the fuel. He hand-cranked the engine. On the third pull, the flywheel caught, and the engine coughed to life with its iconic, rhythmic pop-pop-pop. The sound was a piece of his childhood. It was the sound of his father coming in from the fields at dusk. Behind the tractor sat the tool that was central to his plan. It was a John Deere seed drill from the same era, but it had been modified. Bolted to the top of the main seed box was a smaller, secondary hopper, a Gandy box, designed for planting small seeds like alfalfa or clover. A series of tubes ran from the Gandy box down to the space between the main drill spouts. His father had designed and built the modification himself in the 1940s. It allowed him to plant corn and clover in a single pass, the corn in its proper rows, the clover broadcast evenly between them. It was a unique piece of equipment, a physical embodiment of his family's specific knowledge. The neighbors saw an antique. Arthur saw the perfect tool for the job. He spent the rest of the day in the machine shed, calibrating the drill. This was the most critical part of the process. Too much corn seed, and the plants would be too crowded. Too little, and the yield would suffer. Too much clover, and it might, as Klein had warned, compete with the young corn. Too little, and it wouldn't form the protective living mulch he needed. He did not use a computer or a chart. He used coffee cans, a bathroom scale, and the worn pages of the ledger. He laid a long canvas tarp on the floor. He filled the main box with a bag of his chosen corn seed, a drought-resistant hybrid he had saved from a good year. He filled the Gandy box with the deep-root red clover seed. The clover seeds were tiny, no bigger than a grain of sand, and coated in a pink inoculant to help them fix nitrogen. He jacked up one wheel of the drill and marked the tire with chalk. He knew from a lifetime of use that for every 10 rotations of the wheel, the drill covered 1/100th of an acre. He turned the wheel by hand, the mechanisms of the drill clanking and whirring, dropping seed onto the tarp below. 10 rotations. He stopped. He carefully separated the corn kernels from the clover seed. He weighed the corn in one coffee can, the clover in another. He consulted the ledger. For a dry year, his father recommended a corn population of 18,000 plants per acre and a clover seeding of 6 pounds per acre. His first test run was off. The corn was too heavy, the the clover too light. He made a small adjustment to the gears on the drill mechanism, a turtle lever no more than 1/4 of an inch. He emptied the tarp, poured the seed back into the hoppers, and repeated the process. 10 rotations. He measured again. Closer, but the clover was still too light. Another adjustment, this time with a wrench on a set screw, a turn so small it was almost imperceptible. He did this for 4 hours. He worked with the quiet patience of a watchmaker, making tiny, incremental changes. He did not get frustrated. He did not rush. This was the work. It was the application of knowledge. It was honoring the lessons of his father. The process itself was a form of respect. Finally, the weights were perfect. 18,000 seeds per acre for the corn, 6 pounds per acre for the clover. He was ready. The next day he began. He did not plow the field. A deep plowing, he knew, would only expose what little moisture was left of the sun and wind, and it would destroy the existing soil structure, the network of old roots and wormholes that could act as conduits for water. He hitched a light disc cultivator to the John Deere bee. He set the discs at their shallowest angle, just enough to break up the crust of the hardpan and create a shallow seedbed. He drove the little tractor at a slow, steady pace, back and forth across the 80 acres. The sound of the 2-cylinder engine was a gentle punctuation in the vast silence of the drought-stricken landscape. His neighbors watched him. Bill, from his porch, shook his head. "He's just kicking up dust," he said to his wife. "There's nothing there to cultivate." David Klein drove by on the county road. He slowed his white pickup, watching the small green tractor crawling across the expanse of brown. He saw a futile gesture, an old man playing with antique toys in the face of an ecological disaster. He logged it in his mind as a case study in farmer irrationality, a footnote for a future report on the psychological impacts of drought. He shook his head and drove on. It took Arthur 2 full days to disc the field. He started at dawn, when the air was cool, and worked until the heat of midday became too intense. He rested in the afternoon, then went out again in the evening, working until dusk. His movements were economical. He did not waste fuel or time. On the 3rd day, he hitched up the modified seed drill. He filled the hoppers one last time, checking to make sure the seed was flowing freely. He drove the tractor to the far edge of the field, lowered the drill into the prepared soil, and began a plant. The process was a slow, straight-line meditation. The tractor putt-putted along, leaving behind it the faint tracks of the drill's wheels and the almost invisible slits in the earth where the seeds had been deposited. To an observer, it looked as though he were doing nothing at all. He was moving dirt around, tracing patterns on a dead landscape. But Arthur knew what was happening. He could feel the gentle vibration of the drill as it dropped the seeds. He knew that in the dry, warm soil, the seeds of corn and clover were now resting, waiting. He was not just planting a field. He was placing a wager, a calculated bet based on 70 years of accumulated data. He was betting on the clover. He was betting on his father. He planted for 3 days. He traced 1,000 straight lines across the 80 acres. He finished the last row as the sun was setting on the 5th day of his work. He drove the tractor back to the barn, his body aching with a familiar, satisfying fatigue. He had not looked back at the field. The work was done. The rest was up to the land and the sky. Weeks passed. June bled into a blistering July. The heat did not break. The sky remained a hard, unforgiving blue. No rain came. In the fields around the county, any volunteer weeds that had sprouted in the spring withered and died. The land looked scorched, abandoned. The men at the feed store stopped talking about Arthur's folly. It was an old story, and the outcome was considered so certain that it was no longer interesting. They spoke instead of cattle prices and the rising cost of hay shipped in from out of state. Arthur waited. He watched the sky. He walked the edge of his field each morning. The ground remained bare. The cracks in the earth seemed to deepen. He felt a flicker of doubt, a cold knot in his stomach. Had he misremembered? Had the land changed in some fundamental way? Was the drought simply too powerful for his father's method? He pushed the thoughts away. The book had been clear. The method was sound. He had to trust the process. Then, on the 3rd week of July, the weather changed. Not dramatically. The sky did not fill with dark, promising clouds. but the humidity rose. The air grew thick and heavy. One afternoon, a single, small cloud drifted over Harlan County. It was not a storm cloud, just a stray puff of white against the blue. But as it passed over Arthur's farm, it opened up. It was not a rain. It was a sprinkle, a shower, so light it barely deserved the name. It lasted for 10 minutes. It was not enough to form a puddle. It was not enough to wash the dust from the leaves of the oak trees. Anyone else in the county would have dismissed it as a cruel joke. But Arthur knew it was enough. 2 days later, he saw it. Walking his morning circuit along the fence line, he stopped and stared. He knelt down, his old knees protesting. There in the soil was a hint of green. It was not just one sprout, but a faint, almost imperceptible haze of green, spread evenly across the entire 80 acres. It was the clover. The tiny seeds, needing only the barest hint of moisture to awaken, had germinated. A week later, the corn followed. Strong green shoots pushed their way through the cracked soil, spaced in their perfect, straight rows. The field, which had been a uniform, dead brown, was now alive with a delicate pattern of dark green rows and a light green carpet between them. The sight was so strange, so out of place in the drought-ravaged landscape, that it began to attract attention. People driving down the county road would slow their cars, staring at the impossible patch of green. It looked like a miracle, an illusion. Bill, his neighbor, walked over one evening. He stood at the fence, his arms crossed, and looked at the field for a long time without speaking. His own fields were a uniform tan, indistinguishable from the dirt road. "Ow!" Bill finally asked, his voice rough with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "How is that possible?" "The clover," Arthur said. He did not elaborate. Bill shook his head. "But there ain't been no rain." "There was enough," Arthur replied. David Klein heard the rumors. He didn't believe them. He drove out to Arthur's farm, expecting to see a sparse, struggling stand of weeds that the locals had exaggerated into a crop. When he saw the field, he stopped his truck in the middle of the road. It was real. The corn was only a foot high, but it was a vibrant, healthy green. And between the rows, the clover had formed a dense, living mat that covered the soil completely. Klein got out his truck. He walked to the edge of the field, his mind racing, trying to fit this impossible reality into his scientific framework. It made no sense. His models, his data, his education, all of it said this field should be as barren as every other field in the county. He took out his soil moisture meter. He had been carrying it for months, a tool for confirming the disaster he saw everywhere. He had never gotten a reading above 5% on any dryland farm. He walked into the field, the clover soft under his boots. He pushed the prongs of the meter into the soil beneath the clover. He looked at the digital display. He blinked and looked again. The reading was 17%. He pulled the meter out, walked 10 feet to his left, and tested again. 18%. He moved to the base of a young corn stalk. 20%. It was impossible. It was a moisture level he would have expected after a week of steady rain, not in the middle of a record-breaking drought. He then did what Arthur's father had done 40 years before. He knelt. He pushed aside the thick clover. The ground beneath was cool and dark. He could see the tracks of earthworms. The soil was not hardpan. It was friable, crumbly. It smelled alive. He walked to the edge of the field, to a patch of bare ground near the fence post that the drill had missed. He jabbed the meter in. 4%. The soil was hot and hard. Klein stood up and stared at the 80 acres of green. He was not looking at a field of corn. He was looking at a fundamental challenge to everything he thought he knew. His spreadsheets had not accounted for this. His textbooks had not described it. His professors had not taught it. He felt a profound sense of disorientation, the ground shifting beneath his feet. He had come to Arthur's farm armed with the confidence of modern science, ready to dispense wisdom to a backward old farmer. Now he stood in the middle of that farmer's field, a monument to his own ignorance. He got back in his truck and drove away without speaking a word to Arthur. He had nothing to say. He had to think. August arrived, bringing with it the most brutal heat of the summer. Day after day, the temperature climbed past 100 degrees. The sun was a white, blinding glare in the sky. The drought tightened its grip, but in Arthur's North 80, the corn kept growing. The clover was the key. Its dense canopy completely shaded the ground. While the sun baked the bare earth of the neighboring farms to over 130 degrees, the soil in Arthur's field remained cool. Evaporation, the great thief of moisture, was held in check. The deep taproots of the clover, now reaching down 2 feet or more, continued to pull up subsurface moisture, sharing it with the corn roots that were now following the channels the clover had created. The symbiotic relationship his father had described was playing out in real time, a quiet, powerful partnership unfolding beneath the soil. The corn grew to his waist, then to his chest. The stalks were thick and sturdy. By the middle of the month, tassels began to appear, a sign of a healthy, pollinating crop. Around the county, the few irrigated fields that were still alive were struggling, their owners paying exorbitant prices for the electricity to run their pumps. Arthur's field, without a single drop of irrigation, without any chemical fertilizer, was thriving. The field became a local landmark. Farmers would drive out of their way to look at it. They would stand by the fence, talking in low, respectful tones. The pity they had felt for Arthur had been replaced by a deep, unsettling curiosity. They had all been so certain he was wrong. The evidence of their own eyes was undeniable. It was so contrary to their own experience that they struggled to comprehend it. It was like seeing water flow uphill. As harvest time approached in late September, the difference was stark and absolute. The other cornfields in the county were a total loss. The stalks were brown, barren, and brittle. Most farmers wouldn't even bother running a combine through them. They would be plowed under, a final, costly admission of defeat. Arthur's corn, however, was ready. The leaves were beginning to brown, but the stalks were heavy with well-formed ears. He walked into the field and pulled a random ear. He stripped back the husk. The kernels were plump, deep, and filled out all the way to the tip. It was not a record-breaking ear, not the kind you would see in a year of perfect rain, but it was a solid, marketable ear of corn. It was a crop. He harvested the field with his old John Deere combine, a machine as meticulously maintained as his tractor. The process was slow but steady. As the golden grain poured into the wagon, he could quantify his success. He did the math in his head, a skill honed over a lifetime of farming. The math did not require a pencil. The final tally was 87 bushels per acre. 87 bushels per acre in the worst drought in living memory, when the county average was 0. The number circulated through the community like a shockwave. It was not a rumor. It was a hard, verifiable fact, measured by the weight of the grain sold at the elevator in town. 87 bushels. It was a number that demanded an explanation. It was a number that could not be dismissed or ignored. It was a number that humbled the arrogant and silenced the doubters. It was the quiet, undeniable proof of a wisdom they had forgotten existed. A week after the harvest was complete, David Klein's white pickup truck pulled into Arthur's driveway. It moved slowly, hesitantly, not with the brisk confidence it had shown on his first visit. Klein got out. He was not wearing his neat khaki uniform. He wore simple jeans and a plain work shirt. He was not carrying his clipboard or his digital meters. In his hand, he held a small, spiral-bound notebook and a pen. Arthur was on his porch, sitting in a rocking chair, watching the evening light settle on his fields. He saw the truck arrive and watched Klein approach. He did not get up. He simply waited. Klein stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked up at the old farmer. His face was a mixture of humility and intense curiosity. He looked like a student who had come to his teacher for answers. "Mr. Mills," Klein said, his voice quiet, stripped of its earlier professional authority. "I was wrong." The words were simple, direct, and clearly cost him a great deal to say. It was a complete admission of error, a surrender of his presumed expertise. Arthur nodded slowly. He gestured to the other rocking chair on the porch. "Sit," he said. Klein sat. For a long time, neither man spoke. The only sounds were the creak of Arthur's chair and the distant call of a mourning dove. The silence was not awkward. It was a space for the younger man's pride to settle, and for the older man's vindication to be absorbed without triumph. Finally, Klein spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Can you tell me why? I've run the numbers. I've read every paper on drought-tolerant agriculture I can find. Nothing explains what happened in that field. The soil moisture, the plant health, the yield, it defies all the current science. Arthur stopped rocking. He looked out at the harvested field, the stubble of the corn stalks mixed with the still green carpet of clover. The science isn't wrong, he said. It's just incomplete. It measures the pieces. It doesn't always see how they fit together. He then began to explain. He did not lecture. He told a story. He told Klein about his father, Thomas. He told him about the dry spell of 1954. He explained the principle of the sponge and the bucket. He spoke of the clover not as a cover crop, but as a partner to the corn. He described the deep taproot breaking up the hardpan, the way the living mulch shaded the soil to prevent evaporation, the way it pulled nitrogen from the air. He explained it all, simply, calmly, without a trace of gloating in his voice. He was not claiming victory. He was passing on knowledge. Klein listened, rapt. He did not interrupt. He did not ask questions. He absorbed the information, his pen hovering over his notebook, as if he were afraid to miss a single word. He was not just hearing a farming technique. He was hearing a different way of seeing the world, a philosophy of a land built on observation, patience, and a deep, multi-generational respect for the intricate systems of nature. Your father figured all this out? Klein asked when Arthur had finished. My father learned it from his father, Arthur said, and he learned it from the land. He watched. He paid attention. He remembered. That's the most important part. He remembered what worked. Klein finally looked down at his notebook and began to write. He filled a page with frantic, hurried notes, trying to capture the essence of what he had just heard. He wrote down sponge, not a bucket. He wrote deep root red clover. He wrote living mulch, natural aeration, symbiotic relationship. He was trying to translate Arthur's holistic wisdom into the fragmented language of his own science. This, Klein said, looking up from his notes, his eyes shining with a newfound excitement. This needs to be documented. We need to set up official test plots. We need to write a new protocol for the county's drought mitigation plan. This could save farms. Arthur gave a slight, almost imperceptible smile. It already has, he said. In the following months, David Klein became a frequent visitor to the Mills farm. He came not as an agent of the government, but as an apprentice. He helped Arthur prepare his equipment for the winter. He learned how to grease a bearing, how to sharpen a disc, how to listen to an engine to diagnose a problem. He spent hours with Arthur in the living room, going through the old leather-bound ledger. Together, they transcribed the 70 years of data. Klein entered the rainfall records, the planting dates, the clover densities, and the corn yields into a university computer. He created charts and graphs. The data was undeniable. In every dry year, the fields with a thick stand of clover had dramatically outperformed the fields without it. The correlation was perfect. Arthur's family knowledge, once dismissed as folklore, was now proven as hard, empirical science. Klein wrote a report. It was not like his usual dry, technical documents. It was a passionate argument for a new approach to farming, one based on what he now called the Mills method. He presented it to the state agricultural board. He faced skepticism, but he had the data, he had the charts, and most importantly, he had the undeniable story of the 87-bushel corn crop in the middle of a historic drought. The state approved a grant for a 5-year study on intercropping with deep-root legumes. Harlan County became the center of the project. David Klein was put in charge. His first act was to hire Arthur Mills as the lead consultant. Arthur refused the salary. He agreed only to accept a reimbursement for his fuel. The old John Deere tractor, the one the neighbors had seen as a relic, became an enduring symbol. It represented a different kind of progress, not the relentless pursuit of bigger, faster, and more powerful machines, but the preservation of a technology that was perfectly suited to its purpose. It was a testament to the idea that some things do not become obsolete. They simply wait for people to remember their value. It sat in the barn, cleaned and ready, a quiet monument to a wisdom that had been vindicated. The next spring, the landscape of Harlan County began to change. Several of Arthur's neighbors, including Bill, came to him, hats in hand, and asked him where they could get the deep-root red clover seed. Arthur gave them the address of the small seed company in Iowa that his father had found 50 years ago. That spring, a handful of other fields in the county were planted with corn and clover. The new normal had begun to take root. Arthur's success was no longer a miracle. It was a method, repeatable, understandable process. It became part of the local lore, a story told at the feed store not with pity, but with a deep and abiding respect. One afternoon, Arthur's grandson, Leo, came to visit. He was 16, a quiet, observant boy who had his grandfather's deliberate way of moving. He had watched the whole affair unfold from a distance, hearing the talk in town, seeing the impossible green field, and witnessing the transformation of men like David Klein. He found Arthur in the machine shed, carefully cleaning the Gandy box on the old seed drill. Arthur was showing him how to disassemble the seed metering mechanism, how to clean out the tiny gears with a soft brush and a puff of compressed air. "It's the small things that matter most," Arthur said, his voice gentle. "A little bit of dirt in here, and your seed rate is off. Your whole crop could suffer because you neglected one small piece." Later, in the house, Arthur took out the old ledger. He opened it to the last page, where he had recorded the data for 1988. He showed Leo the entry. Rainfall, 32 inches total. Clover density, thick. Yid, 87 bu'ajret. Leo traced the neat handwriting with his finger. He had heard the stories, but seeing it written down, another entry in a long, unbroken line stretching back to his great-grandfather, made it real in a new way. He turned back a few pages, his eyes scanning the columns. "Grandpa," he said, pointing to an entry from 1967. "It says here the clover was thick, but the yield was only average." "What?" Arthur looked at the entry. A slow smile spread across his face. It was the question he had hoped the boy would ask. It was a question that showed he was looking for the patterns, for the deeper understanding beyond the simple story. He was not just seeing the what, he was asking about the why. "That year," Arthur explained, "we had a late frost in May. It killed the first blossoms on the clover. That meant the nitrogen fixation was slow to start. The corn had enough water, but it was hungry for nitrogen in the early part of the season. It recovered, but it never fully caught up. It's not just one thing, you see. It's everything working together. The water, the sun, the soil, the plants, the timing. You have to watch all of it." He closed the book and placed it in the boy's hands. The leather was smooth and cool. The book was heavy with the weight of years, with the accumulated wisdom of a family and a farm. "You keep this," Arthur said. "You'll need it." In that quiet moment, in the transfer of the old book from one generation to the next, the knowledge was passed. It was not just a collection of data or a set of instructions. It was a legacy, a way of seeing, a deep and patient understanding of a particular piece of earth. The story of Arthur Mills and his field of green corn became a quiet parable in Harlan County. It was a reminder that the newest way is not always the best way, that data without context is not wisdom, and that the most valuable knowledge is often hidden in plain sight in the memories of the old and the soil beneath our feet. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait patiently for people to remember why they were right.